What's up everyone, and welcome to the channel. So in today's video we are going to be talking about wheel spacers and adding those to your vehicle. So I've done this in the past, I've done this on my trucks, I've done this on cars as well. So we have my GR86 and we're going to talk about 6 pros and 6 cons with adding wheel spacers to your vehicle. So let's start off with the setup that I currently have on my car. So I went with 20mm spacers up front and 25s in the rear. You can see that silver piece right there in between the wheel and the hub. And of course you'll see that in the front and in the rear. So the wheel spacers that I put on my car are the bolt-on. You do also have the spacer adapter that you can get. The biggest difference between both of those is that the spacer will go in between your hub and your wheel, and you're going to utilize the stock studs and your stock lug nuts. For the bolt-on kit that I got, I actually bolted the wheel spacer to the hub and then bolted the wheel to the spacer itself. So there's 2 different kinds. There are tons of different sizes and bolt patterns that you can get for wheel spacers to adapt to the vehicle that you have. And so I went ahead and did the bolt-on just because of the size that I got as well. If you're using some smaller spacers, maybe 5mm or something, you can get away with doing the spacer adapter versus the bolt-on like this. So let's talk about a few of the pros and cons while we have the vehicle stationary. One of the pros with adding wheel spacers is to get that aesthetic look. So for my GR86, I have the stock wheel and tire setup. There was a lot of wheel gap and the wheels were very far in. Obviously now they are 20mm out versus being tucked up in the fender. So both front and rear, it just aesthetically looks a lot more nicer, especially with the stock stance. So I have not lowered the vehicle, I haven't messed with the suspension just yet. That video will be coming soon. But just as it sits right now, it looks a lot nicer. And so it's a very inexpensive and effective way to get that stance on your vehicle without going to the next step as far as getting new wheels and new tires. So it does look a little bit funny in the back since the 86 has some very skinny tires. So having them poke out and be that small does give it a little bit of a funny look from the backside, but everywhere else it definitely gives it a much more pleasing and effective look to give it that stance that I'm going for. And along with that, it's going to give me a proper fitment. So I can use these wheel spacers to not only give me that aesthetic look, but it can also help me further down the road with the proper fitment that I'm going for. So when I do get new wheels and tires, I can take some measurements and get the proper offset with the right wheel, the right size to get it to this look here. So it's a really nice way and an inexpensive way to also plan for the future. I can of course leave the vehicle like this, but in the future I can get the proper offset and still have the wheels in the same position and orientation that they're in right now. Because in the past, I've actually put on what I would call the wrong wheel. If you have the wrong offset, you might have to end up adding spacers to get the correct fitment that you're looking for. So if you do spacers first, that can help you to get the proper offset later, so that way you don't have to run wheel spacers with an aftermarket set of wheels. So I think it's good either way. I've run spacers on aftermarket wheels. I've done that on my Tacoma just to get a little bit more clearance because of the larger tires that I put on the vehicle. And that is also one con that we'll go over with adding wheel spacers, is if you put too large of a wheel spacer on, maybe you have too large of a tire, you can actually get rubbing if you have it locked to the right or to the left. So you have to keep that in mind when you're poking those tires out just a little bit. You're going to have some potential for rubbing, especially in some performance driving situations and things like that. Or if you have a lifted truck like I did, I actually had to use the spacers so I didn't get rubbing. So there's some opposites to that. Again, just depends on your setup and what you're running. So onto a downside to wheel spacers is that you actually have to install them on all 4 wheels. If you're going to install wheel spacers, you can't just do 1 wheel, you can't just do 2, you need to do all 4. And the reasoning for that is, if I were to add the 25mm wheel spacers to the rear of this vehicle and then keep nothing up front, I have a wider track in the rear, I have the stock track width in the front, and so that could lead to understeer in performance driving situations. So if I'm taking a turn, I'm doing some spirited driving, I am really pushing this vehicle, I have all that grip, wider stance in the rear, but I have nothing up front to accommodate for the rear. Same goes with if I just added wheel spacers up front. That means that the rear end could potentially go out because I have more grip up front going around a turn. the rear end could potentially slide out. And it's going to be a little different whether you have front wheel drive, rear wheel drive, all wheel drive, maybe not as much. But that is one thing. Just go ahead and install them on all 4 wheels. That way you have an even track both front and rear. Another con to wheel spacers is that you need to make sure that you get the correct material wheel spacer. They do make billet aluminum versus cast aluminum. Billet aluminum is going to be a much stronger material. Cast aluminum, from what I have done research on, may not line up with the hub as properly as the billet aluminum wheel spacers, which I currently have on my vehicle, because there is a proper way to do this. So you can install wheel spacers incorrectly, and that's where they get that bad rep, because somebody didn't torque the lug nuts properly on their wheel spacer. Maybe they put too large of a wheel spacer. They just didn't care. They just threw on a wheel spacer, didn't do research, and they had issues. And that's where the negativity from wheel spacers comes from. So if you do your research, get the correct material, you install the wheel spacers correctly, you have the right size, right offset, do take into consideration the offset of your stock tires or stock wheels too with the wheel spacer that you're putting on, so that way you don't have too negative of an offset and you can have a proper setup for your vehicle. And the last pro for adding wheel spacers before we get this out on the road and talk about a few more is being able to upgrade the brake kit. For the GR86, standard brakes for this model here, if I added more power, if you have a more powerful vehicle and you want to do a brake upgrade and you just need a little bit more clearance somehow, wheel spacers are a good way to get that additional clearance. Now, of course, you can do an aftermarket wheel, get the offset that you need, but in a pinch, or if you even just need a smaller one with your upgraded wheels, that can help you get a little bit more clearance. And like I mentioned earlier, with my Toyota Tacoma, I actually needed the wheel spacers to give me more clearance for the larger tires that I put on for off-roading situations. So it just depends on the build that you're doing and what your vehicle is set up for. So as we set up now behind the wheel of my 86, let's talk about 2 pros with adding wheel spacers. And that's going to be improved vehicle performance and better traction and grip. So since you are widening the track of the vehicle, both front and rear, like I mentioned earlier, you're also giving this a little bit lower center of gravity. And even though on this 86, we have a skinny setup for the stock tires, having them be a little bit wider is going to help, especially around turns like this. So if I give the vehicle a lot of gas as we come around the turn, I'm not going to get the back end out as much as before. Since we had a narrower width, I can actually give this some more gas and feel much more planted. We have a little bit of a bumpy road here. And I've been on this road before I had the spacers, and I can feel a good bit of difference, especially coming around the turns. I am flying through this road, and I can also do that with confidence too, because I have the wheel spacers installed correctly. So let's move on to 3 negatives with adding wheel spacers. We're going to start off with any wheel vibrations. Generally, that is going to be specific for up front. You're not really going to see any vibrations with adding wheel spacers to the rear wheels. So it's going to be all up front, and really the only issues that I've seen, I guess, with wheel vibration up front is possibly adding them to an older vehicle where the geometry of the front end has been in its position for a long time. So I'm in a 2023 Toyota GR86, less than 1,000 miles, adding wheel spacers up front. I haven't had any vibrations or any issues. It's a brand new vehicle. Everything up front is going to be in good condition, of course. So I'm not really going to hopefully see any wheel vibrations. Personally, I've never experienced any vibrations either in any of the vehicles that I've owned. But let's say you have an older version, you have an FRS, it has 70, 80, 90,000 miles on it, and you've had it in its stock configuration for that time period. You add wheel spacers up front, it might throw it off slightly to where you may feel a wheel vibration. Now that's also going to depend on the size wheel spacer that you use and also the offset of that stock tire. So as I mentioned earlier, and even avoiding an object in the road there, we had good steering for that. So I'm gonna come back to that here in a second. But if you have the wrong wheel spacer, maybe it's too thick of a size, different offset with your wheel, that can also affect having any wheel vibrations. So again, make sure you do your research. Get a spacer that I would say is a normal size. I have 20 millimeters up front versus going with an inch, inch and a half, or even larger. Something like that, to me, is going to be a little excessive. If you're going to go with a spacer that large, just go with the correct wheel, get that negative offset that you're looking for, so that way you can help avoid that with the proper balance of the wheel. And that leads us back to number 2, heavier steering, as I just had to avoid that object in the road, and with the driving that you've seen me do. Honestly, I really haven't had any heavier steering in this car. And again, that could depend on the size tire that you're running as well. If you have them wider, you have them poked out a little bit farther, that could affect your steering just a little bit. Again, I've never had any issues with that because I like to keep my vehicles in the closest stock form as possible. So adding a very small wheel spacer on this vehicle, I'm not really messing with that too much. If I go to a larger wheel and tire, I will ditch the wheel spacer and still have more of a proper setup is what I'll call it. But as far as heavy steering goes, that's really just going to depend on your vehicle, and you're going to feel that up front, of course, with the size spacer or the size tire that you're going with. And this, it still feels very responsive. It doesn't feel too heavy. This is a light vehicle, so I'm not going to have heavy feeling steering in this car. But other cars, it may vary. Obviously, there are a million different factors. Now we're going to cover the last 2 cons before we get back to the pros, and that is accelerated wear and safety issues. Now for the accelerated wear, we're going to be focusing up front with wheel bearings, like I mentioned earlier. Now if you put the correct wheel spacer on, like I did on this vehicle here, that can help with not making your wear go faster. So I had one Toyota Tacoma that I put 80,000 miles on. Roughly 40,000 miles of that I had wheel spacers on with the stock wheel setup, and I really didn't have any issues with that because I had, I would say, more of a normal size wheel spacer along with the offset of the wheel. It didn't really throw out the geometry up front to where it would cause an accelerated wear. So again, you just have to do your research with the sizing of it. 20 up front on this car, 25 in the rear. I really shouldn't have any issues, even if I had these on the car for 100,000 miles. Now, if I went with 1.5 inches up front and I was trying to ride around like that all the time, there might be an issue that I would have to come back and revisit and potentially have to replace a few parts up front. So accelerated wear is an issue to have concern for, but at the same time, if you install the wheel spacers correctly, right size, right offset, I know I'm being a little redundant in that, but that's really all you have to do in order to help avoid some premature wear. And along with that is the safety issues. Now for the wheel spacers that I have, the bolt-on ones, they are bolted to the factory studs, and then I have the wheel bolted to the wheel spacer itself. A safety concern for that is that you don't torque down the bolts holding the wheel spacer to the stud or to the hub, and you do that properly. So you need to know what you're doing, of course. In this instance, I need to torque those bolts and then have the bolts on the wheels properly torqued as well. When you have a spacer adapter, you just have to make sure that you have the studs on the wheel properly torqued. So there are safety concerns that you just need to be aware of and know, especially since I can't check the lugs on the wheel spacer itself simply because I have to take the tire off in order to do that. So I added Loctite to them, I torqued them properly, and with that, you also have to have maintenance now. So once a year, anytime I have the wheels and tires off the vehicle, it's a good thing to double check those to make sure that you are staying safe. And the last pro that we'll go over for adding wheel spacers is they are inexpensive, relatively inexpensive, especially when you compare it to new wheels and new tires. So for a good set of wheel spacers, you're looking at spending a couple $100, maybe $300 to $500, just depending on the material that you go with, and the brand too can affect that pricing. But if you go with a proper wheel spacer, you're going to want to spend a little bit more than some cheap spacer. Unless you're getting a very thin one, you don't need that much of a difference. Then you can still go with the correct material, but those might cost a little bit less. When you go with the bolt-ons like these, you are going to have to fork up a little bit more money, but rather be on the safe side than to buy something that is just not going to be compatible with your vehicle. And another pro is just the fact that you can get that great stance, like I mentioned earlier, and not really break the bank. So if you're working on a budget and wheels and tires is something that you're just not ready for, maybe it's in a few years from now, but you still want to get a good look, You can add spacers like what I'm doing right now, and it'll look very nice. And as far as that quick acceleration, before I could get the back end out slightly, but I have a little bit more grip now in the 86. So it's making it a lot more fun to drive because I don't necessarily have to worry about getting that back end out doing performance driving like that. But there's a look at 6 pros and 6 cons with adding wheel spacers. I think it's definitely something that is cool to do if you're looking to build your car very slowly and you want that look, but you don't want to spend a ton of money. I can roll around like this for a long time. I'm going to be lowering this car too and having it on the stock wheels and tires. Personally, I like the look of these wheels, so I like to rock them for a little bit, but still have a little bit more function in lowering the car, giving it a really cool stance and doing it properly. But that is going to wrap it up for today's video on wheel spacers. Be sure to stay tuned for the next video lowering this car. Hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Give it a huge thumbs up and also consider smashing that subscribe button so you guys don't miss out on our daily uploads. And I will see you all in the next video.